Hi guys, welcome back. We are now in a position to move on to the topic of aggregate demand. So guys, aggregate demand basically refers to aggregate means total, right? So aggregate demand is the total quantity of or the total quantity of the total output, that is the real GDP, that all buyers in an economy want to buy at different possible prices. नहीं बोलेंगे, at different possible price levels बोलेंगे. Prices is a micro word. We're talking about a general price level of all the goods and services in the economy. We're talking about the average prices of all the goods and services in the economy. That is why we're using price levels. So aggregate demand is the total quantity of aggregate output or real GDP that all buyers, यहाँ पे all buyers जो है यहाँ पे buyers are referred to not only households here but also to firms, government and foreign buyers, right? So that all buyers in an economy want to buy at different possible prices. Now there are 2-3 definitions of aggregate demand that we will be covering, right? So aggregate demand, first of all, it's a total it's a demand for of all the buyers, that is households, firms, consumers, foreign buyers as well, and the government as well, for domestic real GDP at different possible price levels. And aggregate demand is also basically referring to the total spending on the economy's goods and services at a given price level in a given time period, right? So aggregate demand is basically capturing your total spending as well, right? So aggregate demand is coming, your total demand in the economy for the domestic output is coming from households, firms, and the government within the economy, right? And also from the households, firms, and government in other countries, which means foreign demand for domestic goods, basically, right? अब अच्छा, इसके ऊपर अभी एग्रीगेट डिमांड कर्व क्या शो करता है, इसके ऊपर अभी हम आते हैं. बट फर्स्ट इफ यू टॉक अबाउट एग्रीगेट डिमांड, राइट? सो एग्रीगेट डिमांड को जब हम बात कर रहे हैं एज अ टोटल डिमांड फॉर योर रियल जीडीपी, right? We're actually saying that aggregate demand represents the total quantity of all the goods and services that are demanded in the economy at different possible price levels, right? So what we're saying that when economists are referring to AD as the total demand for real GDP, they mean that it encompasses the demand for all the goods and services that is produced within the country, that of those goods and services that contribute to the GDP, right? While on the other hand, we also describe aggregate demand as the total spending in the economy, because aggregate demand actually refers to the total amount of money that is spent by all the sectors in the economy, that is the spending by households, firms, government, and in the form of net export spending, right? And both these definitions, that is the fact that aggregate demand is the total quantity demanded for total quantity of total output that all buyers want to buy at different possible price levels, and the fact that aggregate demand is referring to the total spending on the economy's goods and services by the consumers, firms, government. Both these definitions are sort of connected, and the connection between these two definitions, lies in the fact that total spending, right? Total spending that is coming from, consumption spending, that is coming from investment spending or government spending or, net export spending, at a given price level. So the total spending by all these sectors at a given price level is basically going to determine the total demand for the goods and services produced within the economy. Hence, that is what connects these two definitions, right? That is a connection. What I'm saying is that the connection between these two definitions lies in the fact that they're more or less the same thing. In fact, they are the same thing. That total spending by these sectors, that is a spending that is done by consumers, firms, government, or spending in the form of net export spending, because exports represents foreign demand for domestic goods, while imports represent domestic demand for foreign goods. So net export spending, right? X minus M equals to NX, which is net exports, X minus M, right? So what we are saying is that total spending by these sectors at a given price level determines that wo jo spending karte hain, that determines the total demand for these goods and services produced within the economy. So hence aggregate demand can be understood as both the sum of these expenditures and as well the demand that drives the production of the country's real GDP, because the sum of these expenditures is what will actually the sum of these expenditures, which is the total spending which would be done in the economy, would determine the total demand for these goods and services that is produced within the economy. So AD can be understood as both the sum of these expenditures and the demand that is, and the total demand that is, or the total demand in the economy that drives the production of the country's real GDP, right? So what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand refers to the total demand of for your real GDP at different price levels, or you can say the total spending on an economy's goods and services at a given price level. So you can write both. I mean, you should be writing both these definitions in the exam, and like I said, they both are the same thing, right? Uh, like I said that the total spending by all the sectors in the economy at a given price level would determine the total demand for goods and services that are produced in the economy, right? Now, coming to the aggregate demand curve, right? If we model the aggregate demand curve, because we're going to be modeling, the the aggregate demand curve in the sense that we want to establish a relationship between price level and GDP, right? So the aggregate demand curve basically would show the relationship between total output, aggregate output buyers would want to buy. Buyers यहाँ पे consumers भी हैं, firms भी हैं, households, government, foreign buyers, right? So all the buyers in the economy would want to buy, or you can say, in other words, the real GDP demanded at the economy's price level. This should have been at, लिखना था मैंने and लिख दिया है, right, at the economy's price level. So the aggregate demand curve is showing the relationship between the aggregate output that people want to buy or the real GDP that is demanded, which is the aggregate output demanded at the economy's different price level, right? That is the AD curve relates real GDP to price level, right? So एग्रीगेट डिमांड कर्व ADS मॉडल आपको बताएगा, अभी AS की तो हम बात नहीं कर रहे, बट AD का जो मॉडल है वो आपको ये बता रहा है कि हाउ इज रियल GDP connected to the price level and how would changes in the price level influence real GDP through the aggregate demand or through the total spending, because changes in the aggregate price level, or the changes in the price level, or changes in the average price level or general price level in the economy would bring about changes in your total spending, which will actually influence the the total demand for goods and services that are produced in the economy, right? And like I said, that changes in the price level, we'll study that changes in the price level would influence, the spending that is done in the economy or the expenditures that are done in the economy. And that would have a subsequent, and that would obviously mean that it will influence the demand in the economy that, it would influence the demand in the economy that drives the production of the country's real GDP, right? So so now let's so the aggregate demand curve slows downwards. और अगर मैं थोड़ा सा दोबारा भी इसको analyze करूँ, whatever I just mentioned, just to sort of recap things. So guys, what we are studying is that aggregate demand basically is defined as the total demand for all the goods and services by all the buyers across the aggregate economy, right? And जब हम aggregate की बात करते हैं economics में, aggregate means adding it all together, right? So unlike demand that we studied in microeconomics, which analyzes individual consumers in individual markets for individual goods, like the market for chocolates or bicycles, aggregate demand in macroeconomics would include all the buyers and the real GDP that they demand across the entire economy. And by all the buyers, we're talking about households, firms, government, or foreign buyers. So in the aggregate economy, consumers, firms, government, and foreign consumers can consume domestic goods, and so aggregate demand is comprised of the goods and services in domestic. So aggregate. I mean, the aggregate demand would be comprised of goods and services in the domestic real GDP that consumers, firms, government, and foreign buyers are willing and able to purchase at different price levels, right? And if you sort of try to look at the aggregate demand curve, which establishes a relationship between price level and real GDP, you see that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, right? And so the fact that it is downward sloping is implying that the relationship between the general price level and the aggregate real GDP, right? The fact that it implies that the relationship between the price level and the aggregate real GDP of the output that is demanded is inverse, right? The real GDP output that is demanded, there's an inverse relation between the price level and the aggregate real GDP output that is demanded, right? अभी हम पढ़ते हैं कि ये inverse relation क्यों होता है, but what this means is कि inverse relation का मतलब basically ये है कि as the price level is going up, the real GDP would be going down as per the aggregate demand curve. But why इसको ये देखेंगे हम. And so what we're saying is that this means that as the price level is rising, and the price level is rising, the general price level rises due to inflation in the economy. So as price level is rising due to inflation in the aggregate economy, consumers, firms, and the government and the foreign consumers are less willing or less able to purchase the same quantity of real GDP output, and therefore they will buy less. And when we say that they will buy less, which means they will demand less, which means they will spend less, right? Because aggregate demand is total spending, right? When you say the total output demanded, so we're saying total spending, right? So they will ultimately spend less, right? And while on the other hand, when your price level goes down, and when the fact that price level going down is the opposite of inflation, which means deflation. So when the price level goes down in the aggregate economy due to deflation, then consumers, firms, government, and foreign consumers are more willing or more able to purchase the same quantity of real GDP output, and hence they will buy more. Hence spending would rise in the aggregate economy, right? So now based in अब जब हम माइक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स में जब पढ़ते थे in microeconomics, the demand curve in micro was also downward sloping, because over there the law of demand is in effect, but it focuses on individual consumers and their tendency to buy greater quantities at lower prices, or vice versa, कि अगर prices lower जा रही हैं तो they will buy more, prices are going up, they will buy less. However, remember that aggregate demand जो है, it involves the demand of more than just individual consumers in the economy, right? Because in the aggregate economy, we must consider the factors that could potentially affect the purchasing behavior of the firms, the government, and the foreign buyers or foreign consumers as well, right? So we'll now see that why does the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards, what are the factors due to which the aggregate demand, we say that aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. And the fact कि हम जब ये factors पढ़ेंगे कि ये इन factors की वजह से aggregate demand curve downward sloping होता है, actually aggregate demand curve simply relation show कर रहा है कि how subsequent changes in price levels, either the price going up or price going down due to inflation or deflation, उसका impact spending decisions पे क्या आएगा. Because spending decisions पे जो impact आएगा, that will impact your real GDP, right? Because remember we talked about how national spending or national expenditure is equal to national output, right? Because if the spending is going up and down, right, it is due to the impact that because your total demand is being affected, your aggregate demand is being affected, and your individual firms, consumers, government, or foreign buyers, they react in certain ways that influences the amount they spend, that influences total spending in the economy, right? And so definitely that would have an impact on real GDP, right? Because aggregate demand captures the spending side of an economy, while aggregate supply would capture the output side, the production side of an economy. So जब हम basically real GDP और price level का relation देख रहे हैं through the aggregate demand, we are capturing the spending side of an economy, right? कि real GDP की value जो है वो किस तरह influence होगी अगर subsequent changes economy में spending की वजह से आ रहे हैं, because AD is spending, total spending, और वो spending changes जो हैं वो price level के changes की वजह से आ रहे हैं, right? So अब देखते हैं why does the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. So guys, the reason why aggregate demand slopes downwards has to do with three reasons, and the first reason that we'll discuss is the wealth effect. Now, as you can see from the aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping, is telling us that when the price level goes up from P1 to P2, your real GDP goes down from Y1 to Y2, and real GDP is denoted by the alphabet Y. इसको आप Q से denote नहीं कर सकते because that was quantity that we studied in microeconomics. This is the aggregate real output, real GDP that we're talking about. So that is denoted by the letter Y, and real GDP and real national income is used interchangeably in macroeconomics, right? So your real GDP is going down from Y1 to Y2, and the reason why real GDP is going down from Y1 to Y2 is basically captured through the aggregate demand curve, which is capturing the fact that total spending is going down in the across the wider economy, and that fall in spending is actually resulting into real GDP going down from Y1 to Y2, right? Because you see, real GDP here is measuring total spending here through the aggregate demand curve, right, guys? Because we're capturing spending here, right? So what we're saying is that when the price level goes up, your real GDP goes down because spending is going down across the economy. And so when price level goes up, there's more inflation in the economy. We move from point A to point B because of a fall in, let's say, spending across the economy, causing your real GDP to go down, right? And because you're and the fact that we are capturing it through the aggregate demand curve is simply telling us that your total output that is demanded across the wider economy, तो एग्रीगेट डिमांड को चाहे आप टोटल आउटपुट डिमांडेड बोले या एग्रीगेट डिमांड को आप टोटल स्पेंडिंग बोले, एक ही बात है. सो टोटल स्पेंडिंग अक्रॉस द इकोनॉमी इज गोइंग डाउन और टोटल आउटपुट दैट इज डिमांडेड अक्रॉस द aggregate economy or total output of real GDP demanded across the aggregate economy is going down. Same thing, right? So the first reason has to do, guys, is the wealth effect. Now, when we talk about the wealth effect, guys, basically what we're saying is that when the prices would rise across the wider economy or across the macro economy from P1 to P2, right? What will happen is that the wealth effect says that the reason why real GDP goes down is because of a fall in spending across the economy, and the wealth effect says that when prices rise due to inflation, consumers' disposable income loses purchasing power. It means that real wealth or real incomes goes down because of a rise in price level. And since consumers' disposable income loses purchasing power, and as a result, consumers are either less willing to demand the same quantity of aggregate real output because now it's more expensive, or they're unable to buy the same quantity of aggregate real output because every dollar that they have would now buy less after inflation. So as a result, an increase in price level across the aggregate economy causes a decrease in your aggregate real GDP quantity demanded of aggregate real GDP, and hence a movement along the aggregate demand curve from, let's say, point A to point B, right? So consumer spending across the aggregate economy is falling. The price level बढ़ेगा, so consumer spending across the aggregate economy falls, and that causes a decline in AD, and hence that is represented by a movement along the aggregate demand curve, right? You need to understand that यहाँ पे consumer spending, which is C component of AD, because aggregate demand captures total spending through consumption spending as well. So C is going down, but C is going down because of a rise in price level, right? So हम यहाँ पे price level और real GDP का relation आपस में देख रहे हैं through the total spending that is taking place across the economy or through the aggregate demand curve, right? Through the lens or through the mirror or through the glass of the aggregate demand curve, through the camera lens of the aggregate demand curve, right? So what we're saying is, right, so and vice versa, or on the contrary, what will happen is that when prices would fall due to deflation is the opposite of inflation. If inflation means price level going up, deflation means price level going down. हमने शुरू में देखा था ये मैक्रो में. So when price level is falling due to deflation, so consumer disposable incomes would gain purchasing power, right? The real value of disposable income and the real value of wealth would go up, and consumers would be either more willing to demand the same quantity of aggregate real GDP output, they would be, or because, and the reason that consumers would either be more willing to demand the same quantity of aggregate real GDP output because it is now less expensive, right? Or they would be more able to buy the same quantity of real GDP output because every dollar that they have to spend would ultimately buy more after deflation, right? And as a result, spending would rise across the wider economy, causing your real GDP to go up and an extension in the aggregate demand curve. And as a result, the decrease in price level across the aggregate economy would cause an increase in the aggregate real GDP that is being demanded to increase. And the fact that aggregate real GDP demanded is increasing is another way of saying that your aggregate spending in the economy is going up, right? Because consumption spending is going up through the wealth effect, right? Uh, so and hence would cause a movement along the demand curve from point B to point A, right? So so basically wealth effect हमें क्या बता रहा है? Wealth effect is simply sort of telling us that why or one of the reasons why a rise or fall in price level causes changes in real GDP that is demanded, the total real GDP demanded, or it has an impact on the spending that is taking place across the economy is due to the wealth effect. And so if the general price level is going down, the real value of money is going up, which will boost the purchasing power of consumers' wealth, right? And the fact that this increase in real wealth would make consumers feel richer and will hence encourage them to spend more, which will increase the overall demand for your which will increase the overall demand for your aggregate real GDP, right? Or will increase the overall demand for goods and services, simply put, right? While if the price level is rising, the real value of money was falling, which is reducing consumers' wealth, and hence it is reducing spending across the economy, causing causing the demand for your total goods and services, or demand for aggregate real GDP to go down, right? And hence causing a movement along the aggregate demand curve from from point price levels was going up, right, from point A to point B. Right, now let's understand the second reason. Now guys, the second factor that we will consider is the interest effect. I mean the interest effect or the interest rate effect. And the interest rate effect को समझने से पहले हम कॉन्सेप्ट पढ़ते हैं इंटरेस्ट रेट्स का. नाउ बैंक्स बेसिकली इंटरेस्ट चार्ज करते हैं, राइट? दे चार्ज इंटरेस्ट रेट्स. And who borrows money? We borrow money. We, as in individuals and consumers, and also firms. Consumers borrow money from banks because they don't have money, so banks could lend them, and consumers would spend on cars and houses and whatever they want to do with it. And firms also borrow money from banks because they want to invest. Investment spending जो firms करते हैं, they could also borrow money from banks rather than using their, rather than financing it from internal sources. They could also externally borrow money and spend on expansion of factories, for buildings, equipment, machinery, and all the gross capital formation जो हमने पढ़ी थी. For that, the banks would lend money to firms, and the firms would pay interest on it, right? So similarly, consumers would pay interest on it as well because they need to return the money to the bank, but they have to pay interest on it, right? So अब हमें देखना ये है कि होता बेसिकली क्या है. यू नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट इंटरेस्ट जो होता है जब इन्फ्लेशन आती है, व्हेन द प्राइस लेवल गोज अप एंड डाउन, दैट कॉजेज चेंजेस इन इंटरेस्ट रेट्स. Because let's first see what happens when the price level goes up. So when the price level goes up from P1 to P2, there's more inflation in the economy. What happens is that we know that the real value of money falls. And when we say that the real value of money falls, it means that, what it means is that the same money can buy fewer goods and services now, the fewer basket of goods and services. So consumers need more money now, definitely, because in order to buy the same basket of goods and services, they need more money, right? And so what happens is that not only consumers but firms as well. So technically what we see happening in the market is, और ये कौन सी मार्केट की बात कर रहे हैं? ये हम मनी मार्केट की बात कर रहे हैं. अब देखिए मनी मार्केट क्या होगी. डेफिनेटली आपको मार्केट के बारे में आपको पता है, मार्केट इज डिमांड एंड सप्लाई. सो मनी मार्केट वुड मीन डिमांड एंड सप्लाई ऑफ मनी. अब मनी मार्केट आपके सिलेबस का हिस्सा नहीं है, A2 के सिलेबस का हिस्सा है, तो हम इसमें ज़्यादा जाएंगे नहीं. बस एक चीज़ मैं आपको बता दूं कि इंटरेस्ट रेट जो डिटर्मिन होते हैं वो मनी मार्केट्स में होते हैं, ठीक है? अब इससे ज़्यादा हम अभी डिस्कस नहीं करेंगे. बस एक बहुत बेसिक चीज़ बस बता दी कि इंटरेस्ट रेट की डिटर्मिनेशन मनी मार्केट्स में हो रही होती है. So what really happens is that when consumers and firms demand more money because the real value of money is going down because the same money is buying less basket of goods and services, and also firms need more money to invest because obviously the same money is now worth less because of inflation. So the demand for money goes up, और जब भी money की demand बढ़ेगी, interest rates will rise. अब ये क्यों होगा? Why would interest rates rise when demand for money goes up? इसके बारे में आपको अभी जानने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, because ये A2 में हम पढ़ेंगे, ठीक है? अभी आपको इतना समझ लें कि जब भी demand for money बढ़ेगी, किसी भी चीज़ की demand बढ़ती है उसकी price बढ़ती है, ठीक है? So ये बात आपको इसकी लॉजिक पता है, ठीक है? So जब हम तो when the demand for money goes up, the interest rate goes up, ठीक है? So when the interest rate would go up, it will have subsequent impact on consumption spending, and it will also have subsequent impacts on investment spending as well. ठीक है. देखें, इंटरेस्ट रेट जो है ना, इट इज़ द प्राइस ऑफ बोरोइंग मनी. इंटरेस्ट रेट जो है, इट इज़ बेसिकली द प्राइस ऑफ बोरोइंग मनी. ठीक है. तो व्हेन द डिमांड फॉर मनी वुड गो अप इन इन्फ्लेशन, इंटरेस्ट रेट्स वुड राइज. अब जब इंटरेस्ट रेट्स राइज होंगे तो क्या होगा, डिमांड फॉर मनी राइज होगी, इंटरेस्ट रेट्स राइज होंगे. एंड जब इंटरेस्ट रेट्स राइज होंगे तो इंटरेस्ट रेट इज बेसिकली द कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरोइंग मनी और द प्राइस ऑफ बोरोइंग मनी. मैंने जैसे कहा कि योर cost of borrowing would rise because firms would now feel that it's expensive to borrow loans. It's expensive. Consumers would feel it's more expensive to borrow loans from banks to finance our housing expenditures or car expenditures or whatever expenditures they want to do. And firms would also feel that borrowing money is expensive to finance investment spending on capital goods and machinery and buildings and factories and equipment and machinery. So basically the amount of so basically what will happen is, as a result, they'll either, some of them might probably not borrow, or some of them might borrow less. So basically borrowing would go down across the economy, both by consumers and firms. And if borrowing goes down across the economy both by consumers and firms, it means that consumption spending will go down, C will go down, and I will go down, which means consumer spending across the economy would go down, investment spending across the economy would go down. And since the aggregate demand curve is reflecting the relationship between price level and real GDP, and we are measuring real GDP, or basically looking at the real GDP through the lens of total spending or aggregate spending or via the aggregate demand curve, because we know that whether we measure real GDP through spending or through output, it just gives the same total, right? And so what it follows is that when the price level would go up, right? If the price level would go up, there would be more inflation across the economy. Your consumers and firms would borrow less because of a rise in interest rates across the economy due to a rise in demand for money, and hence consumption spending and investment spending would fall, which would cause a decrease in your which would contribute to one of the reasons why spending across the economy would fall, causing a decline in your real GDP from Y1 to Y2, and a movement along the aggregate demand curve from A to B after a rise in price level. While on the other hand, let's say if you're if interest rates across the economy would fall, and interest rates across the economy would fall, by the way, just say let's say that the price level across the economy falls. So if price level fall ho jata hai, and that means that there's deflation across the economy, deflationary effects are so if price level falls, basically it will lead to lower interest rates, because when the price level would fall, the real value of money would rise and people could buy more goods and services from the same money. So people would now demand less money, right? So lower prices would lead to lower interest rates, as less people would need less money to buy goods and services when prices are lower. So the demand for money would go down, and when the demand for money would go down, automatically the interest rate would fall, because I've explained the relationship here. Okay? The interest rates would fall. So, and lower interest rates, since interest rate is the cost of borrowing money, so cost of borrowing goes down. So if interest rates would fall, basically if your interest rates would go down, अगर आपके interest rates fall हो जाते हैं, so आपकी cost of borrowing मैं लिख रहा हूँ COB, आप exam में लिख के मत आना इसको, cost of borrowing पूरा लिखना, cost of borrowing would fall because it makes borrowing cheaper, which encourages investment in business expansion, factory expansion, more buildings, more equipment capital. So investment spending goes up, and that also increases consumer spending because people will now buy larger items like homes and cars, and so consumption spending, investment spending would go up, which would cause your it would cause an extension along the aggregate demand curve, simply meaning that total spending across the aggregate economy is going up, increasing your real GDP from, let's say, this is from Y2 to Y1, right? This is an increase in real GDP, right? So real GDP that is sort of captured via your spending would go up, right? And so what it follows is that if the price level goes up, the interest rate, if the price level goes down, your interest rates go down, and that sort of causes an increase in consumption and investment spending, and that would cause your spending to go up across the economy. One of the reasons why spending goes up across the economy, causing an increase in real GDP, and that explains the inverse relation between price level and real GDP through the aggregate demand curve, explaining why the aggregate demand curve actually slopes downwards. Right? Technically, when the price level is going down, it means that there's more spending taking place across the economy, so you move from B to A, right? Well, on the other hand, if price level goes up, the demand for money goes up, and interest rates goes up, cost of borrowing goes up, and that discourages spending because it discourages investment spending and consumption spending. So you move from A to B, right? So there's right. So there's a so right, guys. Hence, it basically sort of reduces your. There's a movement along the aggregate demand curve, so it sort of contracts your AD, right? So it reduces your aggregate demand. Basically, spending goes down basically because of an increase in price level. So interest rate effect is another reason that explains this relationship. Why AD slopes downwards. Actually, AD का downward slope करना simple inverse relation show कर रहा है between price level and real GDP. And since AD is total demand or total spending, so it's showing that this inverse relationship is explaining that why some changes in the price level causes the opposite changes in your spending. If price level goes down, so why is spending? If price level goes up, why is spending going down, right? And if your price level goes down, then why is spending going up? Right, guys? Now, guys, let's move on to the third reason, which is basically the trade effect or the foreign purchase effect that explains why the aggregate demand curve slows downwards. अभी तक हमने देखा कि how the wealth effect would have an impact on a decline in consumer spending, how interest rate effect has a decline in both consumer spending and the investment spending. अब यहाँ पे हम देखेंगे कि how the trade effect comes into play, which causes an impact on your net export spending, right? And since net export spending is part of GDP, because GDP could be measured using the spending methods, we said that net export spending is also part of GDP, because GDP could also be written as GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? So GDP, that is spending based on spending, is equal to your consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export spending, right? So guys, what we're saying is that when the price level goes up, right? So when the price level goes up, what happens is from P1 to P2 due to inflation, right? What happens is that when the price level rises due to inflation, our domestic goods in the economy, domestic goods, you need to understand that, see, हमारे जो domestic goods है ना, we are not the only buyers of our goods in our economy. There are foreign buyers as well. Those foreign buyers could include foreign individuals in different countries, or their governments, or their firms. Maybe they could buy raw materials from us. Maybe they could buy capital goods from us, right? So those foreign consumers, which we are, consumers का मतलब foreign consumers could be firms as a consumer, government, or the individual as a consumer. So what happens is that when price rises due to inflation, our domestic goods, जो हमारे domestic goods होते हैं, they become more expensive in the international market. So अगर पाकिस्तान में inflation आएगी तो हमारे जो domestic goods हैं, we sell a lot of things. We sell agriculture, we sell surgical instruments, we sell sports goods as well, textile as well. So basically, when price rises due to inflation, so our domestic goods would become more expensive on the international market, right? Because our goods would become uncompetitive. The right word to use is that it decreases the competitiveness. इसको लिख लें, it decreases the competitiveness of our exports. Our goods don't really remain price competitive anymore, right? So basically, the competitiveness of our domestic exports decreases, right? Which reduces the demand for exports. So what happens is that when the price level is rising, so domestic goods become more expensive in the international market. That reduces the competitiveness of our exports, and hence foreign consumers are either less willing to demand the same quantity of our aggregate real GDP output from us because our exported goods and services are now more expensive, or they are unable to buy the same quantity of real GDP output from us, because every unit of their currency would now buy less from us after inflation because our goods are expensive now. So due to this fall in the competitiveness of domestic exports, it reduces the demand for our domestic exports, and hence subsequently the revenues that we would generate from our exports would also go down. So the demand for exports would go down, and hence export revenues would go down. And so as a result, an increase in the price level across the aggregate economy would cause a decrease in the aggregate real GDP output demanded because of a fall in our exports, and hence would cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve from A to B, right? Causing a decline in real GDP. And we know that since net exports are a part of real GDP. अब net exports, आपको पता है कि net export spending is X minus M, that is exports revenues minus import expenditures, right? Export spending by the foreigners है तो हमारे लिए export revenue हुआ ना ये, ठीक है? So export revenue बोले तो हम इसको export revenue बोल रहे हैं. Actually, the value of the revenue versus the value of the expenditures done by them from the rest of the world by buying domestic goods from us would be the same, right? तो हमारे लिए revenue है, so export revenue minus import expenditures है, right? So which is actually equal to net export spending. So net exports, it will also have an impact on our imports as well, because what will happen is that because of inflation, since inflation, what inflation will do is that since our domestic goods are becoming expensive, when the price level is going up, our domestic goods is becoming expensive, and because our domestic goods is becoming expensive, that will cause increase in the demand for imports. So import spending by domestic firms, by domestic individuals, or maybe the government could rise as well. So maybe the government used to purchase, let's say, raw material for building roads here, and so now that raw material, if that raw material is getting expensive and buying from abroad is more cheaper because of very high inflation in Pakistan, so probably the government might also import, right? Let's say, for instance, hypothetically or theoretically speaking. So imports would definitely rise because imported goods would become relatively cheaper as compared to domestic goods. So imports will rising, which means import spending is rising while export revenues are falling. So exports are going down, meaning exports going down, meaning export revenues going down, while at the same time import expenditures are going up. And if X is going down while M is going up, it means that net exports are going down, right? Which means that the X minus M is basically going down, right? Which is net exports. So fall in the net exports would cause one of the reasons why your spending across the aggregate economy is going down, and hence your real GDP is going down, which is modeled through the movement along the AD curve from point A to point B. Since net exports is part of real GDP that you measure using the spending that is done across total spending done across the economy, right? Similarly, guys, when your price level falls due to deflation, when things become cheaper in the economy of Pakistan, so the domestic Pakistani goods that we export abroad would become less expensive on the international market. They would become cheaper, so our goods would become price competitive because the inflation rate in Pakistan is going down. So because inflation is going down, price level is going down. So foreign consumers, either individuals, households, firms, or the government, so foreign consumers would be either more willing to demand the same quantity of aggregate real GDP output from us, because our exported goods and services are now cheaper because of lower inflation in our country. So we can now sell them at a cheaper rate. So since the prices of our domestic goods is going down in the domestic economy, so would the price of our exports go down as well. Because of a fall in inflation, the price of our domestic output is falling, so would the price of our exported goods is falling. Because domestic goods agar saste banenge, saste bikenge, so not only in the domestic economy, but the export market price, international market prices would go down as well. So foreign consumers would be hence either more willing to demand the same quantity of aggregate real GDP output from us, because our exported goods, like I said, our exported goods and services are cheaper now, or they would be more able to buy the same quantity. You could also say that they are more able to buy the same quantity, or they're more able to buy the same quantity of output from us, because every unit of their currency, हम यहाँ पे ability के perspective में बात कर सकते हैं, because every unit of their currency buys more from us after deflation. Because now let's say if they pay the same $1 to us, they can now, from the same $1 they can buy more goods and services from us, because our goods are now cheaper simply because of falling inflation in Pakistan. So their dollar could buy more from us, let's say. यहाँ पे मैं एक्सचेंज रेट की बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ, यहाँ पे आई एम जस्ट सेइंग कि देयर डॉलर कुड बाय मोर गुड्स फ्रॉम अस, because their dollar would now buy more goods from us because our goods are cheaper. And the reason why they are cheaper is because of fall in inflation in Pakistan, right? So what will happen is that exports will rise, right? Export revenues will rise, while at the same time import expenditures would fall. M would fall. Why would M fall? M would fall because, you see, when the price level in the domestic economy is falling, when things are getting cheaper in the domestic economy, then a lot of consumers and firms would switch to domestic goods. So they'll be like, oh, you know what, let's stop importing imported goods, because now imported goods are relatively more expensive as compared to domestic goods. Since the inflation rate in Pakistan is relatively going down, or going down simply, so that is making the relative price of of imports more expensive. Relative price of imports का मतलब होता है comparatively expensive हो रहे हैं imports. Imports वैसे expensive नहीं हो रहे होंगे, imports की price वही होगी. हमें relative terms में imports महंगे लग रहे होंगे because domestic goods cheaper हो रहे हैं. ऐसा नहीं है कि imports वैसे महंगे हो गए, नहीं महंगे नहीं हो गए, relative terms में हमें महंगे लग रहे हैं because domestic goods में inflation कम हो गई है, domestic economy में inflation कम हो गई है. तो इसलिए रिलेटिव बोल रहे हैं. सो रिलेटिव प्राइस ऑफ इंपोर्ट्स जब गिरेगी सो ऑटोमेटिकली पीपल वुड सॉरी आई थिंक सॉरी relatively वो महंगे. आई डोंट नो व्हाट डिड आई से बट आई थिंक I lost my chain of thoughts actually. Let me sort of start it over again. What I was saying was कि inflation आने की वजह से what will happen is that because of deflation, when the price level is going down from P2 to P1, what will happen is, as things are getting cheaper in Pakistan, so export revenues would rise because people would feel that things are getting cheaper in Pakistan, so their money would buy more from us, and because our exports are now cheaper, so what will happen is that our exports would rise, export revenues rise honge, while imports would get expensive, and so imports will fall. And the reason why imports would get expensive is because imports relatively expensive हो रहे हैं. Relatively इसलिए expensive हो रहे हैं because domestic goods cheaper हो रहे हैं. So if domestic goods are getting cheaper, right? If domestic goods are getting cheaper, if inflation in Pakistan falls, then there's no need for me to buy from abroad because I can buy the same, assuming same quality. So I can buy the same goods in Pakistan now at a much cheaper price, right? So the firms and the government or the consumers would switch to domestic goods instead of importing it now, right? And so what will happen is, अब उसकी वही बात है कि क्वालिटी और ये और वो, अभी हम उन सब चीज़ों को फैक्टर इन नहीं कर रहे, राइट? सो व्हाट वी आर सेइंग इज दैट अब इंपोर्ट्स की रिलेटिव प्राइस मैं इसलिए बोल रहा हूँ, मैं कह रहा हूँ कि इंपोर्ट्स रिलेटिवली एक्सपेंसिव हो रहे हैं. इंपोर्ट्स रिलेटिवली एक्सपेंसिव हो रहे हैं. रिलेटिवली एक्सपेंसिव होने का मतलब ये है कि हमें relative to our domestic goods expensive हो रहे हैं because domestic goods सस्ते हो रहे हैं. वैसे imports की price में कोई change नहीं आ रहा. It's not that imports are getting expensive and actually they are selling at a much expensive rate to us. नहीं, ऐसा नहीं है. In relative terms वो expensive हो रहे हैं, meaning कि क्योंकि domestic goods सस्ते हो रहे हैं ना, तो अब हमें imported goods महंगे लग रहे हैं. So relative price of imports बढ़ रही है. Actual price of imports same है. Relative price of imports बढ़ रही है. So imports are getting relatively expensive. Relative to domestic Pakistani goods, they are getting expensive. So what will happen is that this will reduce the demand for imports, and when the demand for imports will go down, people will buy less imports, and that will reduce the imported expenditures. So import spending would go down, that is M would go down. M is import expenditures. So M is going down because domestic goods are relatively cheaper and imported goods are relatively expensive, right? So M is going down and X is going up, meaning that net exports जो है हमारी सही लिखा, हाँ, meaning net exports are basically going up, right? Yeah, so net exports are going up. So X minus M, that is net exports are going up, right? Because exports are going up and imports are going down, which means that our net exports are going up, right? इस बात को समझ लें कि imports relative terms में अब expensive हो रही हैं, people will switch to domestic goods, right? और imports इसलिए expensive हो रही हैं because foreign consumers are either more willing to demand this, because foreign consumers जो है फॉरेन कंज्यूम जो डोमेस्टिक कंज्यूमर्स हैं, एक्सपोर्ट्स इसलिए बढ़ रही हैं बिकॉज ऑफ अ फॉल इन प्राइस लेवल, और बिकॉज ऑफ डिफ्लेशन एक्सपोर्ट्स इसलिए बढ़ रही हैं बिकॉज फॉरेन कंज्यूमर्स आर आइदर मोर विलिंग टू डिमांड द सेम क्वांटिटी ऑफ आर आउटपुट बिकॉज आर एक्सपोर्टेड गुड्स आर नाउ चीपर, और देयर करेंसी कैन बाय मोर फ्रॉम अस, दे कैन बाय दिस, देयर करेंसी कैन बाय दिस, द सेम डॉलर कैन बाय the same $1 could buy more from us because every dollar of their currency could buy more because of deflation in our economy because things are now cheaper, right? And that is why the governments also want to reduce inflation in the country because they want the exports to become competitive. So exports are becoming competitive, right? While on the other hand, so exports will rise in that case. While on the other hand, imports would become expensive. The reason why imports would get expensive is it would become relatively expensive. Like I said again, मैं repeat कर रहा हूँ दोबारा ताकि ये बात कॉन्सेप्ट आपके दिमाग में बैठे कि imports would become relatively expensive because domestic goods are cheaper now. So in relative terms, imports will get expensive, and hence people will switch to domestic substitutes. And as a result, your imports would go down while your exports would go up, and hence your net exports are rising. And so net export spending would rise, and technically your economy would move from, let's say, point B to point A. And so your real GDP is going up because net export spending is part of your GDP, right? So if net export spending goes up, your GDP that is measured via spending captured through the aggregate demand curve is basically going up. So इतना कॉम्प्लिकेट नहीं करेंगे, सिंपल what we'll say is कि the price level is going up, the foreign trade effect जो आपका trade effect है वो show कर रहा है that your real GDP is rising from Y2 to Y1, and there's a movement from B to A because of the interest rate effect, and obviously जो reasons है मैंने आपको बताए, right? इस चीज़ को जहन में रखें कि when the price level decrease होती है domestically, our goods become cheaper relative to foreign goods, which is leading to an increase in exports and a decrease in imports, as foreign buyers increase their demand for cheaper domestic goods, and domestic consumers and firms switch from more expensive foreign goods, because now they're relatively more expensive, to cheaper domestic alternatives. Right, guys, so this is what explains why the aggregate demand curve actually slopes downwards. And like I said in the start, that aggregate demand curve shows a relationship between aggregate output, that is total real GDP, that buyers, that is consumers, firms, foreign buyers, domestic buyers, government and in firms would want to buy, or real GDP demanded at different price levels, right? So it's relating the AD curve, or that line is reflecting or relating the real GDP to price level. And so it follows that if the price level goes up and down, if the price level goes up, your real GDP goes up because your spending is being influenced because of a rise in price level. Sorry, I think again. So if the price level is going down, your real GDP is going up. A fall in price level is causing a rise in real GDP. So, if the price level is going down, your real GDP is going up because your spending is going up, right? Well, on the other hand, if your price level is going up, right, if there's more inflation and things are getting more expensive across the wider economy, your real GDP is going down because, your spending is going down, and the reasons why spending is going down. So a rise in price level is causing a fall in spending, or spending के different components हैं. The spending by foreign consumers, and spending by domestic consumers, firms, government. So a rise or fall in price level influences different aspects of spending, or different components of spending, right? And so different effects have different effects on different components, right? So the spending is going up or down because of these three effects, right? Because of the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the trade effect. And that explains why spending is inversely related to price level, such that if the price level sort of goes up, right, there's more inflation. If the price level goes up, then your spending goes down, right, because of the interest rate effect, the trade effect, and the wealth effect, right? While if the price level goes down, things become cheaper, your spending across the economy goes up, and so real GDP is going up, right, which we're sort of trying to measure through spending, real GDP, right? And for that, we are sort of drawing an aggregate demand curve that is telling us that since aggregate demand is total spending, it's the aggregate total demand of different goods and services across the wider economy. That is another way of saying it reflects total spending across the economy. So मैं बार बार इसको 2-3 अलग अलग तरीकों से रीज़न बोल रहा हूँ ताकि हर एस्पेक्ट को आप प्रॉपरली कैप्चर इन करें. And that explains why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, guys. That I think we're done with this video, and quite comprehensively we have covered this video actually. And now in the next video, we're going to be discussing the factors that could potentially cause a shift in demand curve. When would aggregate demand shift up and down, right and left? and we're going to be discussing, the individual components of AD as well, and the factors that could influence consumption spending, government spending, and net export spending. So, guys, that's it for this video. I'll see you all around in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Until then, take care.